What's up, guys? Coach Yeager here. Hope you all are doing well today and everything is going good for you and your family. Just a couple of things before get started. If you saw in the daily message from Monday, trying to set up a Zoom meeting, I'll let you know that will probably be later in the week, just to give any updates pertaining to what's going to be happening the following week. I do not know at this point in time what exactly is going to happen, but I do foresee that we will be out of school for a considerable amount of time. How long, I don't know. But just going to kind of go over some things there, just speak to you guys, make sure you're all doing okay. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me at any given point in time, and just let me know what's going on. Hopefully, I fix the videos, and hopefully, you are watching and paying attention to these videos and moving along. I kind of treat it as just like I was in class, and would be going over this information um, with you guys. And so we're just going to keep moving along. I also said that there would be a quiz coming up. Date to be set right now. I would look forward to that either coming to you on Thursday or Friday. It will be an assessment via Power School Learning on the haiku page. So just be on the lookout for that, and I'll give you more details. Any type of test that we will have, I will send out and put up on one of those dates a review guide. Go through that information to make sure you're good. Most of it will be what I cover in these PowerPoints, just going through them, making sure that you're getting the information and that everything is getting down pat. All right, so today we're going to take a look at one of the antebellum reform movements. That's an offshoot of the Second Great Awakening, and that is going to be the early abolition movement. Now, if you remember back from the Second Great Awakening, the primary and overarching goal of the Second Great Awakening and the people inside of it was to purify the world, to make the world pure, to get rid of the sins that scourged America. And one of these sins that scourged America happens to be slavery. All right. Now you remember back when we were talking about the Missouri Compromise, one of the approaches that some men had in America during this time period was to colonize the freed African Americans, uh, to go ahead and send them back to Africa once they are freed. And it would be a gradual emancipation. Owners that would go ahead and emancipate their slaves would be compensated, but still at this point in time, the coexisting of races was not a very strong point that people were trying to make. They didn't think it could work. They didn't think that it was particularly a good thing to keep freed blacks next to their former plantation owners. And so, therefore, they founded what becomes known as the ACS, or the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816. The American government bought a piece of land in what is present day Liberia on the west coast, or what we call the Horn of Africa. Right? And they established a capital there, Monrovia, named after President Monroe. And there was some very prominent members that were a part of this American Colonization Society. One of them being Henry Clay, James Monroe, president. James Madison was a president that was a part of it. Daniel Webster, who we'll talk more about later. Um, and their premise basically was to take, right, former slaves, send them back to Africa, and compensate the owners. Now, the early abolition movement saw this as not enough. This was not good enough. No, we're not going to send them to Africa. They're going to be free, and we do not want to compensate the owners. And the first man that really started pushing this, right, was a guy by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. He was an American Anti Slavery Society member, and he disapproved of colonization 100%. He wrote a paper called The Liberator, and it stretched from publication from 1831 to 1865, up until the point that that 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, which of course ended slavery. Now, it has to be stated that abolition at this point in time, in the early 1830s, um, was especially radical. There was really, prior to 1831 and William Lloyd Garrison starting the Liberator and his American Anti-Slavery Society, there was only three people that would be considered, or three groups of people, should I say, that would be considered abolitionists at this prior to 1830. And that would be, of course, freed blacks, slaves, and Quakers. Right? Prior to the 1830s, those were your primary abolitionists, and Quakers weren't that vocal to begin with, and of course, no one paid attention to enslaved people. So when William Lloyd Garrison started coming out and putting a paper, printing a paper, and mass publicizing this paper throughout the Northeast, right? This was shockwaves, right? It was a radical movement, especially in the early years. And just to note, there was a an abolitionist printer by the name of Elijah P. Lovejoy, um, and they broke into a mob broke into his printing press and threw his printing press into a river that was nearby to stop him from printing these what they quote unquote called seditious acts. um, Elijah went out to go confront the mob about throwing his printing press, which was very expensive at the time, into the river, and the mob ended up killing him and hanging him. And so, therefore, Elijah P. Lovejoy died as a martyr for a cause. But just to give that to make that note that this was a very radical movement, and it's especially in its early years, and it was met with a lot of hostility. Now, if you take a look at the heading of the Liberator, all right, so this is the mass heading that's on every copy, all right, that goes across the top, like the New York Times or the Washington Post. But this is the Liberator's heading, and if you can see here, it's got three pictures. So it's got the slave trading market taking place, and then of course enslaved people here, and you got to see this archway with the flags. That's supposed to represent freedom, but the big thing right here, right, is this centerpiece. And what's happening here? You see, love thy neighbor, right? And of course, this is supposed to represent Jesus and mankind in man form. And then you see the slave owner right here. Let's take a little zoomed in look. I thought I got it in. There it is. Take a zoomed in look at it, right? And you can see, right, Jesus coming back down with the staff, all right? He's casting, right, out the plantation owner, and you can see the enslaved man there in bondage praying to him. Right. So this kind of shows you that William Lloyd Garrison was a very religious man, and used religion and the Second Great Awakening and the movement of it and free salvation for all and trying to purify the world. These people felt via the Second Great Awakening that religion was on their side. I mean, if you look from an editorial piece in right? The Liberator. It says a higher law. We pronounce the Constitution the most bloody and heaven daring arrangement ever made by men for the countenance and protection of a system of the most atrocious villainy ever exhibited on earth. Holy crap! The most atrocious villainy ever exhibited on earth. And that's bold right there. Continuing, such a compact was, in the nature of things and according to the law of God, null and void from the beginning. Nobody of men ever had the right to guarantee the holding of human beings in bondage. So now they're using the Holy Bible, all right? They're using scripture, they're using different things to defend the fact that they are right, that slavery is the most atrocious villainy ever on earth. Now, what will be interesting about this is the fact that the South will also use the Bible to counter, all right, the abolition movement. They will say that it's a positive good. Riddled throughout the Bible are stories of bondage and of slavery, which is interesting to note that when we get to it eventually, you will see that freed African Americans, once they are out of bondage, they will revert a lot to the stories of Moses, right? A very biblical time. They are hearing these, and a lot of their songs that they sing are psalms, and they talk about these different things, and it's coded messages. The Bible was for them was a way of sending messages to one another, secret codes and whatnot. Because again, at this time, you have a sweeping revival taking across the nation, particularly in the Northeast and the burned over district, but it's also reaching the South. And so this was a very religious time. You had one side using the Bible as a weapon against slavery, and you have another side using the Bible as a weapon for slavery. Right? And of course, like I told you, the early abolitionist movement was a radical movement. I mean, here is a look at one of a newspaper article that they put out saying, outrage, an abolitionist is giving a speech right this evening at 7 o'clock. You need to be there. Let the rights of the states be guaranteed by the Constitution and protected. And just to kind of show you how it was a very radical movement and the people reacted against this, there were riots all the way 1832 to 1836 in northern cities against speaking out against abolition, and that they didn't like it. Okay, and then here is John C. Calhoun's rebuttal back to it in 1837 of the positive defense of slavery. I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. Right? They felt that they were giving these people religion, they were giving these people a good life, so they thought. And of course, the abolitionists would come right back. And so this is really where the social bonds between North and South are starting to get tattered. Most Southerners, as we keep moving forward into the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, of course, when Civil War starts, is the fact that a social rift is developing between the North and the South, not just politically, but socially as well too. As Southerners start to feel that all Northerners want to end their peculiar institution, right? And so you can see right here, right, that is a woman with duct tape over her mouth. Otherwise, we just like to know this as the gag rule, right? So something that states tried to attempt to push through their state legislatures. And then they attempted as well to try to get it forbade throughout the nation, but particularly in southern states, they attempted to place through what's known as the gag rule. And basically, the gag rule would stop any anti slavery petitions from being published in their newspapers. And that's a direct violation of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But what happens with the gag rule is that Congress eventually will pass it, all right, and then southern states will pass it as well too. And what this will do is an attempt to try to stop anti-slavery petitions from riling or inciting the thoughts and the fears of Southerners. And I found this little meme right here: silence is golden, duct tape is silver. Right? They couldn't silence them. Right? Again, they couldn't stop them from speaking out and continuing to keep making these papers, even though a gag rule was in place. But still, they couldn't stop them, but they would attempt to stop them. And so what also starts happening is African American worship starts in the antebellum period, if you remember from yesterday. In the North, it was segregated worship, and in the South, it was integrated worship, which this is unique and interesting. And you can see here, this is the slave balcony up here of the antebellum church. Plantation owners would take their slaves to church with them. Why would they do this? So that they could hear the message. Of course, they didn't allow them to read and write. Not many could read and write at this point in time. Some could. It would take an event to stop that from happening. Right. And so they would bring them to church, right? And they were giving them religion, which this is how they used it as a positive good. This is how they showed to people, hey, listen, we're giving them religion. We're taking care of them. Their souls are in good shape. Still, that isn't enough, though. Right. Now, some of the black abolitionists that started to spring up that I told you about in the early abolition movement, the three primary groups were, of course, free blacks, slaves, and then Quakers. Well, now we add in another one, which is this during the antebellum period, we add in, William Lloyd Garrison and the Anti-American Slavery Society, or the American Anti-Slavery Society, pardon me. Right, and so now we also have these black abolitionists as well too. The first one to really start putting it out there was a man by the name of David Walker, and he put an appeal out there in 1829, an appeal in 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world. This is a little excerpt from it. He goes, "Now I ask you, had you not rather be killed than to be a slave to a tyrant who takes the life of your mother, wife, and dear little children? Look upon your mother, wife, and children, and answer God Almighty, and believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty." And what he's saying right here is that it's not bad for you to go and take arms up, right? It is within the command of God that you rise up and take arms. And he says it right here that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you. And so while David Walker himself did not physically go out and attempt to start riots, people who read this did. And one of those people who read David Walker's appeal to colored citizens of the world uh, was Nat Turner. Right, and in 1831, Nat Turner leads the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history in Virginia. About 200 people died in total, and it was put down after 2 days. What this rebellion shows is that slaves are learning to read and write. They are communicating, and so that they are getting ideas. And so, basically, put after this, Southerners become very, 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 should I say, suspicious of any attempt to rile up their slaves, right? They felt that it was bad, and so therefore they will put in a bunch of brand new rules. Some of these being intact that slaves cannot learn to read or write. Um, and so therefore they cannot be educated, and therefore thoughts cannot enter into their brain. They will put stricter rules into place for runaway slaves. Fugitive slave laws will get more strict. And basically, in 1831, what you guys in your head and what you may think of slavery, and the horrors and the atrocities that take place, they really start happening. This is where that slavery, that vision of slavery that you know, it really starts in 1831. Slavery takes this turn to a more violent practice, and it was a command practice. It was to keep people from thinking that they could get out. And again, just look at the picture here as described the horrid massacre in Virginia. Right, man with a hatchet, woman with babies right there, and grabbing a man, and he's saying, "Oh no," and they didn't care. They still killed him. All right. All right. Another black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick was probably one of the most articulate and one of the best orators in not just the abolition movement, but all of U.S. history. All right. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped in Maryland. His father was actually his plantation owner. His mother was a slave. He taught himself how to read and write, and he became a very, very popular, like I said, anti-slavery speaker. His most famous work was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, um, and it was a bestseller across the world, not just in the United States, but across the world. And he did not call for violent um, rebellions to take place. He was going to put pressure on the president. He was going to put pressure on Congress, and he would be heard. He would let his voice be heard. Hi. Another man that was an African American who was a abolitionist was a man by the name of Solomon Northup. All right, who wrote 12 Years a Slave. It is a narrative of a free person of color from New York who was abducted and sold into slavery in Louisiana. They made a movie out of it, a best-selling movie. It was a best-selling book at this point in time, and it talks about how uh, freed African Americans would then get abducted from the North and sold back into the South. And that's where we're going to stop today with the abolition movement. We'll pick up on it again. We'll talk about some of the other characters as we move along. The big things to take from this, again, as I go back through, it'd be better just to go here. That, right, the early abolition movement during the antebellum period was started by the Second Great Awakening in an attempt to purify the world. Early abolitionists felt that the American colonization society was not enough, that it didn't do enough. One of the leading advocates in this early abolition movement was William Lloyd Garrison, an American anti slavery society member totally against colonization. He wrote the paper called The Liberator, which was in circulation from 1831 till 1865. I also want you to know that in the early days, right, abolition was a very radical movement. Right? Abolition was based in the thrones of Christ, they talked about a higher law coming from the Bible, right? And that it was a radical movement, and therefore there were, right, uh, riots that took place against abolitionists and their speakings. Right? Southerners reacted to this rise of abolitionism and quoted back as a positive defense that it was good. Slavery was good for people. Right? They attempted to stop the abolition movement by putting in the gag rule, stopping anti-slavery petitions from taking place. Right? And to show that they were doing good, right? Uh, Southern plantation owners would take their slaves to church with them, right? Some of the black abolitionists, first one, David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world, telling them to rise up and take arms against their plantation owners and other whites. That led to Nat Turner's rebellion, the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. About 200 people died. And this is where the slavery that we know it as really begins. Slavery starts, the Southern slave owners start ratcheting down and putting very strict and stringent rules in place. No reading or writing was to be allowed. What you envision of the horrors of slavery really start taking place in 1831 for this 30-year gap between 1831 and 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is elected president. Frederick Douglass, one of the most well-renowned orators in American history, and what he does to advance is write his book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and another best-selling book, of course, by Solomon Northup, was 12 Years a Slave, which was made into a movie. Again, I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll speak to you guys tomorrow.